Well, good afternoon. I'm delighted to see everyone here. I am Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator for the Ramsey County Library, and I am so pleased to welcome all of you to this talk, our Tuesday with a Scholar, Tuesday Scholar we now call it, Tuesday Scholar Talk with Elaine Tyler May, a Regents Professor, that's the best kind, a Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota, who is going to be talking about her new book, Fortress America, which has a great subtitle, How We Embraced Fear and Abandoned Democracy. So we're going to hear about that in a minute, but first I want to thank the people that make this possible. First of all, our partners at OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota. We are so grateful for their support. And then Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, who is the financial underwriter of these programs. So without further ado, I will now turn the podium over to Professor May. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy, for that nice introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming on this beautiful fall day. We don't have too many of them, and so to be inside in the middle of the day is a sacrifice, I realize. Is the sound okay? Is it squeaking, or is it too loud or too soft or anything? It's okay? All right, great. So, Americans have been this closer. Americans have been preoccupied with security, both national and personal, since the early years of the Cold War. The question is, are we any safer as a result? Are we a stronger, better society and nation? There's considerable scholarship on American national security and foreign policy, but there is less on the domestic side of that coin, the long-term quest for personal security at home. My talk today aims to shed light on this security obsession, how it evolved, and what has been its impact. This history dates back at least a century, but let's begin with the onset of the atomic age, when the connections between foreign and domestic security policies and practices rose to the surface of national life. The presence of the bomb and the frenzy over communism at home and abroad heightened fears across the nation. Americans knew what nuclear war might look like because they had seen it. Only one country had waged nuclear war, and that is still true today, and that one country is the United States. So if we, the good guys, could drop the bomb, why not the bad guys? The Soviet Union acquired atomic weapons in 1949. How could America be safe? In order to avoid big government programs that might resemble socialism, policymakers rejected large-scale public civil defense efforts and instead encouraged citizens to protect themselves through private efforts, particularly by remaining constantly vigilant and by fortifying their homes. The media did its part to keep citizens alert and insecure. For example, on July 26, 1950, the front page of the Los Angeles Times reported experts weighing A-bomb peril here. So I saw this in the archive, and I pictured my parents in Los Angeles sitting over their coffee, sipping their coffee with one hand and looking at the Times with the other, me, the little toddler, running around on the floor around them, and looking at this. To help readers figure out their own likelihood of being incinerated, the paper carried helpful illustrations. One map shows 6 hypothetical targets of atomic bombs dropped by the Soviet Union on Los Angeles. Another shows concentric circles from a potential ground zero, each one indicating different levels of blast, fire, damage, and destruction. So, yeah, well, civil defense officials and enterprising businesses offered homeowners tips on constructing basement shelters or backyard bunkers or even the all-concrete, blast-resistant house for the atomic age. Very few homeowners actually constructed shelters, but the message was clear. The world was dangerous, and citizens were responsible for their own safety. Over time, a domestic arms race developed parallel to the nuclear arms race. Citizens responded to perceived threats by fortifying their homes and arming themselves. Soon, Americans could boast that they had more missiles and more pistols than anyone else. The United States nuclear stockpile consistently outnumbered that of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982. So this kind of shows you the arms race and who was ahead from the beginning. By the early 1990s, the percentage of American households with guns, that's the arms race at home, was far above other industrialized countries. It's even worse today. We'll get to that. It was not only the atomic age that made citizens fearful. Domestic dangers were also real. By the late 1960s, crime was rising and inner cities were exploding. While dangers were real, citizens responded with exaggerated fear and distrust, much of it now focused on crime. A 1974 study concluded, quote, "The fear of crime in the U.S. is such a fundamental social problem which has not yet received the attention in proportion to its severity and which may well prove to be more difficult to treat than criminality itself." So here, this is an observer saying, a study actually concluding that fear of crime may be more dangerous, actually, than crime itself. While it's difficult to quantify fear, and especially fear of crime, it's very nebulous, but we do have public opinion poll data from particular years that indicate the level of fear. So here, a poll taken in 1981 showed that while the chance of being murdered was a mere 1 in 10,000, and becoming a victim of violent crime was just 6 in 1,000, fully 4 in 10 Americans polled reported that they were, quote, highly fearful of assault. So here's the fear and here's the reality down here. More than half said that they dressed plainly to avoid attracting the attention of attackers. A majority reported that they kept a gun for protection. So how did this happen? Long before crime filled the headlines and the airwaves, there was the alleged communist threat. Anti-communism was, quote, in the air, according to St. Paul native Patricia Hampel. Some of you may know Trish Hampel and her work. She's fabulous. So this is a quote from her memoir. She remembers her terror as a child in the 1950s, unable to sleep for fear of, quote, the communists who lurked in the dark. She did not know, quote, whether to watch for man or beast, goblin or reptile, malicious intent or natural disaster, something so large and looming or a thing so insidiously small that no degree of vigilance could assure safety. I didn't know. Trish could read that better, but that's from her book. Noting the power of the new medium of television, she recalled watching TV shows, including the nightly news, which were filled with dire warnings about the communists. Still, she wrote, quote, I could not concoct my communists. They remained simply dread. Well, such anxieties were not merely figments of an overly active imagination. Private enterprise did its part to whip up fear of communists. In 1953, for example, where did that go? There we go. In 1953, a public service ad in Newsweek for Norfolk and Western Railway pictured a frightened boy at home at night in a dark hallway with the caption, "You needn't be ashamed of being afraid in the dark, son. The darkness is a hiding place for confusion, greed, conspiracy, treachery, socialism, and its uglier brother, communism. In the USA, you are free to become vigilant, to see what's going on. If you ignore this responsibility, what you lose in the dark may be your freedom. And that word vigilant keeps reappearing in all of these kind of fear-mongering ads and notices. Innocent children inside their homes appeared particularly vulnerable. Communists were not the only threat. The government was equally dangerous. A 1950 public service announcement in U.S. News and World Report from the electric, light, and power companies warned of increasing government control and assured readers that the company was, quote, battling this move toward a socialistic government. The ad pictured a small boy in front of a table holding 4 symbols of freedom: a key, a Bible, a pencil, and a ballot. The Freedoms Foundation warned that it, quote, could happen here with an image of a father apologizing to his son for his lack of vigilance. Now the boy will have to grow up under communism. As these ads suggest, gradually the home shifted from the place that provides protection, and here you see early post-war homes that are very contained around inside of walls and fences and protection to kind of barricade it off from the public world. And here we see an article from House Beautiful. Did the neighbors know your business? Good living is not public living. In 1964, House Beautiful commented on the shift with a full-page illustration of a fortified house with cannons, boarded-up doors and windows, alarms, guard dogs, locks, loudspeakers, and a large sign announcing burglars go home. The Ladies' Home Journal followed suit in 1968 with an article figuring several gadgets that could be purchased to make the home more secure against intruders. Companies that stood to profit from fear of crime did their best to whip up terror. In 1970, for example, General Telephone and Electronics took out a full 2-page ad in Time magazine promoting their new intercom system. One side of the ad was a full-page photo of a man wearing a trench coat, face obscured by a hat. The facing page said in large, bold letters, "Who's downstairs ringing your bell? A friend or the Boston Strangler?" These rudimentary devices eventually gave way to elaborate security systems, alarms, and safe rooms. The private security business in the United States increased from $17 per capita in 1970 to $208 per capita in 1991, a total industry increase from $3.3 billion to $52 billion. By the early 21st century, consumers could contemplate a custom-built quantum sleeper, a bulletproof cocoon complete with CD and DVD player, microwave, and refrigerator. Google it. You can order one for yourself. The locks, gadgets, barricades, and warnings against dangerous strangers reflected a growing siege mentality that began to surface in the mid-1960s. So we're going to crank back the clock a bit. And it wasn't just about crime. Although crime was increasing, even at its peak in the last half of the 20th century, the rate of violent crime barely exceeded its highest point in the first half of the 20th century, as you can see in the 1930s. Throughout the 20th century, the murder rate remained below 11 murders per 100,000 population. In the mid-1960s, the crime rate was still relatively low, with violent crime affecting fewer than 2 people in 1,000. At its height, the rate of all violent crimes remained below 8 victims per 1,000 population. Now, when we look at graphs like this, the changes look fairly dramatic. But if we consider these numbers in terms of percentage of the population, these variations appear actually quite slight. The murder rate remains consistently below 1/100th of 1% of the population, and you can see that the red line is homicide, and the blue line above it is violent crime. So there is some variation, there is some uptick, but if you look at it with this kind of a graph, it's much less alarming than the previous graphs. So you can illustrate trends in a variety of ways, and even the illustrations, as much if not more than the statistics themselves, can tell a story. But regardless of the slim likelihood of becoming a crime victim, crime came to stand in for many of the upheavals at the time that disrupted the Cold War order, including political protests, urban riots, and the many challenges to the status quo and authority structures at the time. Politicians were quick to respond with a call for law and order. Now, this was a new campaign issue. In the early Cold War years, from 1948 until 1964, candidates warned of the communist menace for sure, and they also promised to be tough on organized crime. But there was no mention of street crime in any presidential candidate's acceptance speech or in any inaugural address. This changed quite dramatically in 1964. Law and order leapt into the center of political debates and stayed there for the rest of the century, and still there. While the issue of crime was taking hold, in 1964 the Cold War still loomed large. Candidates vied over the greatest dangers facing citizens and who would offer the best protection. Now, in 1964, some of us are old enough to remember that election, Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater said that he would not rule out using tactical nuclear weapons in war. In response, Democratic incumbent Lyndon Johnson aired a powerful television ad suggesting that his opponent would unleash nuclear war. Some of you have probably seen this. Some of you probably even saw it in 1964. When I show it to my students, they're like, whoa, but I'll show it to you all today.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So audiences at the time, and no doubt most of you, would recognize that that was actually Lyndon Johnson speaking. He didn't have to say, "I'm Lyndon Johnson and I approve this ad," right? His voice was very recognizable at the time. Well, that ad was so controversial that it aired only once, and then it was pulled from the campaign. But it received tremendous attention. News programs aired the ad over and over again in their coverage of the controversy, so it got a huge amount of airtime. The Daisy Girl appeared on the cover of Time magazine, and 2 major networks did stories on her. Many analysts claimed that this ad ushered in a new era of television attack ad campaign advertising. Now, Republican candidate Barry Goldwater responded with his own fear-mongering, not about atomic war, but about crime, political protest, and social chaos.
graft, swindles, juvenile delinquency, crime, riots. Hear what Barry Goldwater has to say about our lack of moral leadership.
Well, Johnson easily won the election, but Goldwater's message on crime and social chaos set the tone for later campaigns. In 1968, the year we are commemorating this year with the 50 years, there's a lot going on at the university, the Historical Society. I hope some of you have been able to participate because it's a really great moment of retrospective history. In 1968, both Republican candidate Richard Nixon and American Reform Party candidate George Wallace focused on law and order. Nixon had a well-earned reputation as a fierce anti-communist. In 1968, he turned his attention to street violence and political protest. Nixon ran a television ad that turned the tables on civil rights, using the term to address law and order.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. Let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
There's a lot of subtle messaging going on here. Nixon drew no distinctions among crime, urban disturbances, and political demonstrations. In the ad, an eerie shot of an unclothed female mannequin, a female mannequin torso tossed on the littered street, underscores Nixon's pointed use of the term domestic violence to convey public, not private mayhem. His subtle use of language turned the terms of the Black freedom struggle and the feminist movement, civil rights and domestic violence, against them. The third-party candidate running for president that year, George Wallace, had a well-earned reputation as a segregationist. In one ad, he combined the anti-busing message that was geared towards protesting the busing of children to integrate schools. He combined that message with a warning that city streets were dangerous, especially for women.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Follow as your children are bused across town.
As president, I shall, within the law, turn back to absolute control of the public school systems to the people of the respective states.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Take a walk in your street or park tonight.
As president, I shall help make it possible for you and your families to walk the streets of our cities in safety.
Well, it may or may not warm the cockles of this Minnesota audience, warm your hearts, to recognize that the only candidate to address crime as a social problem in 1968 was Hubert Humphrey.
You're not going to make this a better America just because you build more jails. What this country needs are more decent neighborhoods, more educated people, better homes. We need more jails. We can build them, but that ought not to be the highest objective of the presidency of the United States. I do not believe that repression alone builds a better society.
Where's Hubert when we need him, right? Humphrey in 1968 was the last candidate of either party to articulate an approach to crime that addressed underlying causes. The last one. Look, you can see, there's a wonderful website for those of you who are curious about these things. It's called livingroomcandidate.org. One word, livingroomcandidate.org. I got all of these clips from that site. It's got every television ad from every candidate of a major party, including a major third party, from the beginning of television ads, and along with it, the transcript. It's a really great site if you're interested in, particularly in this election season. It's very interesting. Well, Nixon and Wallace combined won 57% of the votes, although Humphrey's loss was in large measure due to his association with Johnson and the Vietnam War. The election results taught the Democrats a lesson. 4 years later, Democratic candidate George McGovern embraced law and order and anticipated the war on drugs. Now, I think it's really interesting to go back and look at his television ads, because McGovern has sort of been seen as one of the most left-leaning of all Democratic Party candidates, and that may be true in terms of his economic proposals and programs. But listen to him on crime and drugs.
You're never going to get on top of crime in the United States until you get on top of drugs, because half of all the crime in this country is caused by the drug addict. They'll kill, they'll steal, they'll do anything to get that money to sustain that drug habit.
Not a lot of compassion there. The media contributed significantly to whipping up fear by focusing on rare but heinous crimes to an extent far out of proportion to their frequency. Television and newspapers contributed to exaggerated fears of random violence by strangers. As the civil rights movement and feminism brought more African Americans and women into the public arena, the media reflected the backlash against those movements by reviving the age-old trope that black men were a danger to white women. The popular press saturated readers with the message that attacks on city streets were practically inevitable. As early as 1963, U.S. News and World Report exhorted women, quote, "First scream, then scram. Muggings, rapes, and assaults have become common," which of course they were not. The Washington Post warned women not to walk around alone at night, to keep all doors and windows locked, and to install burglar alarms. By 1970, Time magazine asserted that, quote, "The most crime-prone segment of the population, poor urban youths aged 15 to 24, will increase disproportionately at least until 1975. Sheer demography adds a racial factor. Half the nation's blacks are under 21. So you don't even need to tease out subtleties when it's this blatant in a place like Time magazine, where the racism is absolutely explicit, unabashed, unapologetic. Prediction. And we'll get to super predators in a little bit. Time's warning was not subtle. Young blacks were crime-prone and their numbers were increasing. Time warned its white readers that, quote, "It is chiefly young black males who commit the most common interracial crime, armed robbery." Interracial crime. These messages were profoundly misleading. The most likely victims of violent crime then as well as now were men of color. The least likely victims of violent crime were white women. Moreover, women were much safer statistically on the city streets or even in a dark alley in the middle of the night than in their own homes, where the vast majority of violence against women took place. So here's the message. Women are told, go back home where you're safe, which was the least safe place for them. Nevertheless, the media focused on women who ventured out into public streets as particularly vulnerable to attacks by strangers. Not surprisingly, public opinion polls showed that women were most likely to fear becoming a victim of crime, even though they were the least likely to actually be victimized. So the power of the media and these messages out in the public world, can't be ignored. Really, really effective. Hollywood did its part to foster fear and encourage citizens to take crime control into their own hands, vigilante style. And we start seeing vigilante heroes, well, we saw them in the Westerns, but we start seeing more vigilante heroes in urban-centered dramas before we start seeing legal vigilantism, which is what we have now in the Stand Your Ground laws. The very popular Death Wish films starring Charles Bronson began in 1974 and continued into the mid-1990s. The plots of all 5 increasingly violent Death Wish movies follow the protagonist whose wife is murdered and daughter is raped by a gang of thugs who break into their home. The villains in these films are usually portrayed as racial minorities or white hippies who commit mayhem. The ineffectual police can do nothing. The main character, a New York City architect who had been a gentle, loving husband and father and a bleeding heart liberal, is transformed into a gun-toting vigilante out for revenge. Well, just in case you didn't see these movies, not that I suggest you run out and see them.
You want to know what was happening while you and Joanna were living it up in Maui or Cali or Yowie, whatever it is?
What?
There were 15 murders the first week, and 21 last week in this goddamn city.
That's a lot.
You know, decent people are going to have to work here and live somewhere else.
By decent people, you mean people who can afford to live somewhere.
Oh, Christ. You are such a bleeding heart liberal, Paul.
My heart bleeds a little for the underprivileged, yeah.
The underprivileged are beating our goddamn brains out. You know what I say? Stick them in concentration camps. That's what I say.
I don't think I have to tease anything out from that. Let me show you now the trailer for this film.
Enjoy a typical afternoon in New York City.
My name is Paul Kersey, young man.
I'm sorry. She died a few minutes ago, Mr. Kersey.
Any chance of catching me tonight?
There's a chance, sure.
Just a chance.
I'd be less than honest if I gave you more hope, Mr. Kersey.
This is Paul Kersey. This is the story of a man who decided to clean up the most violent town in the world.
Listen to the railroad. Give me the money.
He begins where all the super cops leave off.
Money has gone down by how much, sir?
$9.50 a week to $4.70 to be reported last week.
You understand that. So many people know that.
And you want to keep it that way, huh?
Oh, no, we have to keep it that way, Inspector. This whole city would explode.
This person is listening to my voice. I urge him in the name of law and order to desist from this one-man crusade and turn himself into the police.
Let's see the money, man.
Call him a mad vigilante. Call him a hero. Either way, he's always on target.
Well, now you don't have to go out and see the movie. You just saw the whole plot right there. Yeah, well, viewers report that audiences in theaters stood up and applauded when the hero shot the first mugger, and I'm sure you could see the, the color of the bad guys compared to the good vigilante hero. At least one viewer boasted that he went out and bought a gun after seeing Death Wish. Many other popular movies carried similar themes, with violence providing the solution. During the Reagan era, the proportion of films ending in violence increased steadily, reaching 30% by 1990. Well, vigilante justice was not only confined to movie screens. In December 1984, Bernard Goetz, a white subway passenger, shot 4 black youths when they tried to rob him in a scenario much like the one depicted that you just saw in the Death Wish movie 10 years earlier, 1974 movie, 1984. Goetz kind of almost mimics that scene of the subway. Goetz quickly became a folk hero. Although he was charged with attempted murder, assault, and several other crimes, the Manhattan jury acquitted him of all crimes except for one count of illegal possession of a firearm, which in all likelihood would not be illegal today. According to a Newsweek poll taken 3 months after this attack, 57% of respondents approved of Goetz shooting the youth. Half said they had little or no confidence in the police to protect them against violent crime. U.S. News and World Report was quick to comment with a telling political cartoon depicting the inside of a crowded subway car. All the passengers are armed to the teeth, including elderly women, as one passenger reads a newspaper with the headline, "Muggings Down." The message was clear. The way to stop crime was for citizens to carry weapons, become vigilantes, and protect themselves like Goetz. Racialized fear-mongering intensified during the 1980s, reaching a new low in 1988 with the infamous Willie Horton ad by Republican presidential candidate George H.W. Bush, which featured a black man on parole who raped and murdered when he was released from prison under the watch of Governor Michael Dukakis.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
So that was the famous Willie Horton ad, the race-baiting ad that helped propel George H.W. Bush to the White House. Now, the Democratic candidate, Michael Dukakis, self-identified liberal Democrat, responded not with a condemnation of Bush's race-baiting and fear-mongering, which he certainly could have done. I mean, that was such a bald, horrifying, racist ad, but rather with a Willie Horton ad of his own featuring a Latino parolee from a federal prison who raped and murdered a woman during Bush's years at the helm of the CIA.
George Bush talks a lot about prison furloughs, but he won't tell you that the Massachusetts program was started by a Republican and stopped by Mike Dukakis. And Bush won't talk about the thousands of drug kingpins furloughed from federal prisons while he led the war on drugs. Bush won't talk about this drug pusher, one of his furloughed heroin dealers, who raped and murdered Patsy Pedren, pregnant mother of 2. The real story about furloughs is that George Bush has taken a furlough from the truth.
Well, these kinds of messages had an impact. One study found that for white viewers, fear of crime increased when criminals portrayed on television, even in fiction, were minorities, but fear of crime did not increase when the criminals portrayed were white. Still criminals doing the same things. In the 1990s, although the crime rate actually declined, fear continued to rise. So here you see violent crime is going down pretty dramatically, and it has continued to go down despite what we may hear from the occupant of the White House and others. Crime has continued to go down since the beginning of the 1990s. Between 1989 and 1994, the percentage of those polled who said they were truly desperate about crime nearly doubled from 32% to 62%. Now, these are the years, 89 to 94, when the crime rate was actually going down. As you can see, it wasn't that all high to begin with, 0.07% to 0.7% to 0.6%, but down nonetheless. And there you see almost doubling of fear in those years. As movies like Death Wish suggest, many people had little faith in the government or in government authorities, as well as law enforcement, because of a widespread belief that the police could not be trusted to protect citizens and may not be around when needed. Private security companies began patrolling neighborhoods. From the 1970s onward, expenditures for private security exceeded expenditures for law enforcement. A New Jersey security agency, for example, offered a, quote, family protection plan that provided personal bodyguard service. Customers began hiring bodyguards to take them into New York City or to go shopping. During the 1980s, the employment rate in the private security industry increased dramatically and far outstripped the rate in law enforcement, which declined. By 1994, public perception of crime as the most important problem in America reached an all-time high. The Cold War was over, but the war on drugs took its place. Bringing atomic age fears full circle, in 1996, an ad for the Republican presidential candidate Bob Dole began with the same footage of the little girl with a daisy taken from the 1964 ad for Johnson.
30 years ago, the biggest threat to her was nuclear war. Today, the threat is drugs. Teenage drug use has doubled in the last 4 years. What's been done? Clinton cut the Office of National Drug Control Policy by 83%. And his own Surgeon General even considered legalizing drugs. Bill Clinton said he'd lead the war on drugs and change America. All he did was change his mind. America deserves better.
Just for the record, no political party had a claim on being tough on crime and embracing law and order. Both political parties were equally, let's say, vigilant about it. The two most draconian crime bills were passed under Democrat Lyndon Johnson and Democrat Bill Clinton. The two most strict and horrific crime bills that had things like, mandatory minimum sentencing and that kind of thing. Dole's ad reflected the continuation of a trend that began in the 1950s, which was the panic over juvenile delinquency. Children, while often portrayed as vulnerable, also appeared as threatening. Although the crime rate was already declining rapidly in the 1990s, especially crimes committed by youths, polls revealed a vastly exaggerated sense of the danger. In 1994, juveniles committed only about 13% of all violent crimes, but Americans polled at the time believed that juveniles committed 43% of violent crimes, 3 times the actual proportion. Not simply afraid for their children, Americans were becoming afraid of their children, especially black children. And here we get the super predators. In 1996, Princeton political scientist John DiIulio made a startling prediction. Looking at demographic trends, he asserted that by 2005, the number of 14 to 17-year-old males would increase by 23%, and that the rate would rise faster among black children than among white children. This really echoes that article from Time magazine in 1970s. Assuming that black boys would necessarily become violent teenage criminals, he coined the term super predator and called the trend a, quote, ticking time bomb that would unleash a storm of predatory criminality on the nation. Well, his predictions were widely circulated, I mean widely. Dozens of major newspapers all across the country, political leaders were quoting him. It just took off. But it never happened. Youth crime continued to decline. and to decline dramatically. But the headlines were all about the super predators and the storm of criminality that was impending. False and frightening predictions, like DiIulio's, had an impact. Black people were incarcerated far out of proportion to their crimes. By the end of the century, 1 out of every 4 young black men was in jail, on probation, or on parole. For-profit prisons expanded across the country with financial incentives to keep more people incarcerated for longer periods of time. Between the 1970s and the end of the century, the prison population grew tenfold, from 200,000 to more than 2 million. The rate of increase for prison costs was 6 times greater than for higher education spending. By the late 1900s, not only criminals lived behind bars and walls. Increasing numbers of non-incarcerated Americans locked themselves up in fortified homes. Nowhere is this bunker mentality more obvious than in the rapid proliferation of gated communities across the nation's residential landscape. In the 1960s, the numbers of gated communities began to grow, increasing in the 1970s and skyrocketing since the 1980s. Residents of gated communities often own their own streets, pay for their own services and utilities, and provide their own security guards. An illusion of safety makes the wide streets more dangerous because cars speed and children play without the wariness they gain when living on public streets. In some cases, privatization actually makes these neighborhoods less safe. Police and fire emergency vehicles have trouble entering these communities because access is restricted. Researchers report that children become fearful of strangers, especially strangers who look different from themselves. A 1995 study found that most residents chose gated communities for security. They believed they were safer inside the gates, but in fact, they were not safer. There was actually no significant difference in crime rates between gated and non-gated communities with residents of similar income levels. So if you control for socioeconomic status, it's the same whether or not the gates are there in terms of crime. And you can see here that those who are living in the gated communities report that security was very important in their choice of living there, although it really made no difference. And they also felt that the gates provided protection against crime, that they would help in crime reduction, which wasn't true. The crime rates were the same, in part because people inside gated communities could just as easily commit crimes against each other, right? Unfriendly warnings and barriers did little to keep out crime, in part because, some of the residents who lived inside the gates committed crimes at the same rate as those outside and equally were victimized by crime. Perhaps the perfect symbol of the trend toward privatized protection is the sport utility vehicle, the SUV. Although sales of SUVs declined in recent years due to rising gas prices and the economic crisis, during the last 2 decades of the 20th century, they were the fastest growing segment of the auto industry. Just like gated communities, families often purchased SUVs because they appeared to offer safety. But SUVs are more prone to rollovers and braking failures than cars. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration reported that SUV occupants are 11% more likely to die in a traffic accident than those in cars. But people buying SUVs buy them for safety. SUVs are also dangerous to other cars. In the event of a side impact collision with an SUV, car occupants are 16 times more likely to die. I'll show you one last little clip here because on one level it's a remarkable feat of creativity using, digital imaging. But at the same time, I think it shows that the idea of an SUV, just like the idea of the tough guy vigilante, is very masculinist, and it's very much associated with the rugged outdoors, with power. Anyway, you can see. There's tons of these. Go on YouTube. They're actually wonderfully entertaining. They're very creative. But, there's a very powerful message here. You're not just buying these things for safety or, to get the kids and the dog to the supermarket, which is what most SUVs actually do. Very, very few of them ever go off-road. Well, the last incarnation of the SUV was, in fact, a military vehicle, the Hummer, a civilian version of the Humvee used in the armed forces in the First Gulf War. Arnold Schwarzenegger urged automakers to develop the Hummer in the mid-1990s, bringing the aura of foreign military campaigns to the city streets. In 2001, the future governor of California promoted the new Hummer H2 at its unveiling in Times Square. Not exactly the rugged outdoors. Although at less than 10 miles per gallon, the Hummer did not survive the economic collapse. Its presence on American streets at the turn of the 21st century was a symbol of the times. People say that people look like their dogs or their dogs look like them. Maybe cars. Anyway. By the end of the 20th century, long before 9/11 and new security fears, Americans had altered the way they live because of fear of crime. A study of 8 major cities showed that nearly half of all Americans changed their lifestyles to avoid crime by not going out alone or at night, avoiding downtown areas of major cities and subways, and avoiding contact with people who look or seem dangerous to them. Many parents, dubbed helicopter parents, are so worried about their children's safety that they hover over them, refusing to let them out of their sight. A vigilante mentality permeates society. 40 states now allow citizens to carry concealed weapons. Stand your ground laws have made vigilantism legal with disastrous results. And going back again to the armed society, here's 2007, guns per 100 residents in 2007. I don't have this updated to today, but today it's 100%. There's 1 gun per capita in the United States. So, are we safer? Are we more secure? As the 21st century unfolds, there's little evidence that Americans are safer or more empowered as a result of more weapons, more gated communities, or more muscle cars. But the security obsession has created an armed and bunkered citizenry. There are more guns on the streets, and locks on the doors, walls around neighborhoods, and along the nation's borders. Citizens don't trust one another. Hostility to government and lack of concern for the common good may have made the nation considerably less secure. Locks on the doors did not protect families against losing their homes through mortgage foreclosure. Guns in their pockets did not prevent citizens from losing their shirts to Wall Street greed. There is no evidence to date that our national obsession with security has actually made us more secure, but it very likely has made us more undemocratic. So I'll end with that, and we can have a little time for talk. Thank you.
And I'm sure people have questions, but let me bring the mic around. Okay, I see a lady's hand over here. Because we're being filmed, we want to make sure everyone, including the audience on the camera, hears the question.
One of the excuse me, one of the other things that changed in the 1980s and 1990s was the advent of video gaming, violent video games in particular. Do you have any information on what impact that had on our fear of the people we lived with and of the advent of this increased vigilantism, the sense that I can take that power?
That's such a great question, and it's a question that comes up a lot in discussions of, what's the role of the media in all this? And, I looked at some films, but I didn't go into video games. There's been a lot of speculation that they do increase the kind of, vigilante mentality and violent impulses. But then, there's other opinions about it, like it's a sublimated way of getting aggression out for, I just don't know the answer. I didn't look at that. I think it's a great question, a great research topic for somebody other than me. Because I don't really want to watch those things, to tell you the truth.
Other questions? Okay.
When I saw the word fortress, I was thinking of border walls.
Yes, me too.
Have we just moved at a slight degree, the same campaign, to immigrants now as the major danger?
Well, there's nothing new about the immigrant bashing and anti-immigrant sentiments that we're seeing today. It's as old as the country is old. And it's just terrible once again. And it's dangerous. The idea of a wall is fill in the blank. It's one more example of a fear-mongering of people who, for all intents and purposes, we should welcome and not fear.
Okay, I see a question. Who else? Show me your hand so I can bring the mic.
We often learn or can learn from cultures that do things differently. And we know that some cultures approach particularly some of the Northern European countries, guns, prisons, drugs in a very different way. Do you have any information, not in terms of we know they're safer, but how about the level of fear as they walk around the streets? Do you have any information on whether they are less fearful than Americans?
Only anecdotal. In my research, I came across cases where people who came from, let's say, Northern Europe came in, and one family, their 7-year-old daughter went out exploring in the neighborhood and came back home after I don't know how long, and told her parents that it was a really strange place because there were no kids out playing on the streets, and she didn't run into any neighbors, and it was just empty. Meanwhile, neighbors started running over to them saying, "My God, is everything okay? Your daughter was out wandering," And, they talked about the fact that their daughter was accustomed to walking to school by herself, taking the bus by herself to go downtown for various outings or errands. And, they were shocked to see the way that American parents hovered over their children and didn't allow them the freedom to explore or become independent individuals. A dissertation at the university some years ago looked at suburban wives and mothers and had questions about their sense of security in their neighborhoods and their child-rearing practices. And they said themselves that they did not allow their children the kind of ordinary day-to-day freedoms that they had themselves when they were children, to just go out and play and be back at dinner time. I mean, I kind of look around the demography here. That's how it was when I grew up, you know. And even my son, if I wanted to find him, I'd try to find the dog, who was always sitting on the front step, and now even the dog couldn't wander around without a leash. Well, I believe in leash laws, but my dog for a long time did not comply. Anyway, so I have anecdotal information that people from other countries find this not only strange, but also oddly detrimental to the socialization and mental health of children.
Given the American culture based on the gun that freed the West, provided security for the pioneers, the American culture that sells automobiles and political candidates through fear, with that as part of our cultural norm in this country, what, if anything, would change the direction of fear, motivation of fear within this country? What would it take? Is there a possibility of such?
I think so. I'm an optimist. Let me say in this particular season, voting. In the last election, out of the eligible voters, so a lot of people are not eligible to vote. But out of the eligible voters in the last election, 22% voted for the Republican candidate, 23 or 4% voted for the Democratic candidate, and 42% voted for nobody. The 42% determined the outcome. So if you want to do anything, get out there and knock on doors and drag people to the polls.
Who has a question? Okay. Could other people raise your hand so I can bring the mic around faster?
I should also add that, you know, to develop a commitment to the common good is going to take effort at the grassroots, at the top, on every level, and, you know, having a stake in the running of the democracy. You know, the baseline is voting, but there's a lot more that has to happen for that cultural shift to take place, I think.
Being married to someone who won't answer her door because of all the true crime dramas that she sees, to what extent is the explosion of that kind of programming, even though in most cases you're being killed by your loved ones rather than strangers and outsiders, has that contributed to the problem?
So we all live in the city, and I would bet we all lock our doors. And I think it's much more an economic problem than it is a violence problem, because almost anybody who comes to your door is not interested in harming you. They want your stuff. And as long as we have this vast disparity between the rich and the poor, we're going to have property crime because, you know, it's an opportunistic crime. And if you don't have anything or you don't have much, you're going to try and get it from those who you see as having more than their share. And, you know, we have a vast, vast and widening catastrophic gap between the very, very rich and everybody else. So, yeah, you know, I lock my door. I do. You know, we live in an urban environment in which, you know, poor people are trying to get along just as the rest of us are. But if I lost my computer, I'd be dead.
Going back to the Charles Bronson movie, wasn't it Giuliani that claimed that the subways are so dangerous and he brought the subways back to the real people? Did you come across, was there any change in the subway crime prior to him? versus, let's say, now?
You know, there's a whole lot of speculation and studies on, you know, why did the crime rate go down, not just in cities, but everywhere. And I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of really good literature on that. All I know is that it did, but the fear kept going up. But it's a really important question. You know, what does make a crime rate go down? Yeah, Giuliani wanted to take credit, of course. And yeah, he's still a pretty powerful guy.
I see a lady with her hand up.
I just want to say that I want to ask a question, but I also want to say, having lived in New York, when I watched people right in front of me pickpocket and take necklaces off, Giuliani did make a difference.
Good.
Huge, huge difference. It just wasn't happening afterwards. But it seems to me that the press knows what's going to sell is negative stuff.
If it bleeds, if it bleeds, it leads.
Right. So what can we do to change that?
Raise responsible journalists. I don't know. I'm sorry, I have a son who's a journalist, so I believe in the media, but I think that the economics of reporting has become so politicized that, you know, every outlet is now kind of targeted to a particular niche, with the exception, for the most part, of you know, certain public media outlets that are in danger of having their budgets cut because they rely on public funding. But yeah, I mean, we can't minimize the importance of the media in all of this. And you know, that journalists are told to get the stories that are going to sell the papers, and they do that often.
This is actually more of a response to the former question about what can we do. There's a wonderful group in town called the Vital Aging Network. And if you Google Vital Aging Network, you will see not only do they have wonderful forums for people that help you discern what to do, what you might be able to contribute and how, but they also hold a class called Evolve that is specifically geared toward people helping find what their niche is in helping to support the common good. That's their whole background. So I just urge people who are not familiar with that to check them out, Vital Aging Network.
Thank you for that. I tried really hard to end my book on a positive note. You know, I had hoped to have it done before the 2016 election, and I didn't. And then I had to kind of change the arc of the book a bit. But I do think that there's a lot of interest now in the common good, in getting involved, in being active in our political world, and I think that's a really good sign. So thank you for that tip.
Thank you.
In conversations with your students, what are they afraid of?
Me. No, you know, we unpack these things in class, and you know, students come from a wide variety of backgrounds, and you can't anticipate the points of view of your classes until you get in there and start having conversations. And you know, it's wonderful to see students engage with each other over issues of real import. And I love to see the sparks fly, and I try to encourage that because, you know, I have students interview their parents and grandparents or someone of those generations around issues of, you know, the world we're in. And that gives them a little distance from themselves, but, you know, then they have the opportunity to discuss, you know, points of view over time. And it's, you know, I wouldn't generalize, you know, what they're afraid of or not afraid of, what they want to do with their lives, their level of interest in the public world. You know, I just do my best to get students engaged in the world. I'm teaching a class now where the vast majority of the students in the class came from very conservative families, and that comes out in their oral histories of their parents and grandparents. And we talk a lot about why it's important to be involved in the world, to be involved in politics, whatever your persuasion is. And I have one guy who just comes from a long line of hippies, and he's always he's always arguing with the rest of them, and it's great to see. It's great to see because they can actually, in a world where people don't talk across those big political divides, a classroom gives you a great opportunity. You just set the rules. You can argue with the ideas, but you don't attack the person. And once you get that straight, students are very respectful of that. And so I think that universities are really good places for encouraging citizen engagement on all levels. And we can hope that at some point it will trickle beyond the precious world of academia that some of us inhabit.
I think it's been observed that people are really chronically unable to evaluate risk realistically, that especially it's the relative risk of different aspects of their life, in their health and in their activities and in all kinds of areas. And then it seems like there's a lot of people with ulterior motives who are exploiting this inability that is so common. Is there anything that academics and researchers and journalists can do to help people understand risk better?
There's actually a lot of scholarship going on right now among historians about risk. I have a brilliant former student who wrote a dissertation, is now coming out as a book on a cultural history of the insurance industry, which absolutely shocked me to read her study and to find out how much our world is literally designed by insurance companies and how our notions about our own personal risk are shaped by this huge industry. And she's in conversation with a lot of other scholars who look at risk and try and determine, how do we really understand risk? What is any individual's risk? Her project is called the Actuarial Age, and it's all about how these kinds of risks are determined. But I should just add a footnote to that, because her new project that she's working on now is about astrology. And you may be surprised to know that on Wall Street, big investors consult astrologists as much as they consult the investment tables and everything else, and that the astrologists are just as accurate. I'm not kidding. I don't make this stuff up. I heard her give a talk about it at a conference, and it just knocked my socks off, along with everybody else. So, how we assess risk and how we understand it, it's beyond me, I'll tell you, but it's fascinating. So, again, I hope, others like my former student keep on with this. Yeah.
I have an observation more than a question, but I'm wondering how much good it would do, and I don't know if everybody does what I do, but with all these negative political ads, I changed the station to public TV or an old station like 9/4 because I can't stand it. And if we all would let them know that we don't pay any attention to this and they're throwing their money away and they just shouldn't allow such ads. You be positive and speak what you're going to do. None of that stuff. We don't put that on the air. That should be the rule. Can't we make that if we let them know? Could that not happen?
Well, you're braver than me. I don't even turn the TV on anymore. No, I mean, that's literally true. And truth be told, and I hate to confess this in public, because I used to have my radio always on NPR or National Public Radio. And I've switched now to the classical music station, and believe me, it does wonders for my mental health. Those of you who are news junkies, just try it. My husband is the news junkie. I ask him if there's anything I need to know in the world. But I feel a little guilty because, I don't think I miss anything because whatever's happening is so much in the air. But I think I'm safe to say this in this room because my son is in Washington at the National Public Radio headquarters where he's a producer, and I haven't admitted to him that I've turned off the news. But as I was saying before, there are journalists who are very responsible, and I can't listen to the pundits or anything else, but there are places where journalism and really effective investigative reporting have done just fabulous work for bringing the realities of what's going on in the world into people's lives. And if you can sort of cut through all of the partisan niche broadcasting and everything, there are really good people out there doing good reporting. I miss a lot of it because I'm listening to classical music. But thank you. I think we should all be, if it got to be not effective to spend gobs of money on TV ads, then obviously they would switch to something else. I think getting out the vote is more important than TV ads.
Question over here.
Where does the civil rights movement of the 60s fit into the fear-mongering that developed?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I was a co-organizer of two programs that were just this last Thursday at the U in a series called Race and Justice. And one of the visitors was the outreach director from the Southern Poverty Law Center, who spends her whole life on exactly this question. And the other one is a retired federal judge who is now writing a book about a group of black men who she was forced to sentence under mandatory guidelines with sentences that she didn't believe were just. And she's gone back to write their stories and follow them in their lives. And, it's a little simplistic to say, but many scholars have looked at this, that, the 1960s and 70s, too, are, decades of ferment and advances for civil rights, feminism, and a lot of other it's the rights revolution. And as these things were happening, there was a backlash happening at the same time. And, as the visibility of these movements like civil rights moved from, the nonviolent kids, trying to integrate a school in the South to the Black Panthers in Oakland, they were busy trying to get breakfast programs going, but they were mostly shown with their militaristic look. And so, I think a lot of this is a reaction. There's a really wonderful book that I drew on heavily in my work by a scholar named Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. Some of you may know the book. And, she basically sees how, starting with slavery, there have been, in pretty much every era, new ways of enslaving black people in one way or another, and she sees mass incarceration as the most recent manifestation of that. So it's a complicated and difficult and painful issue, but something that we really need to look at. And if we want to talk about the impact of fear, all we have to do is look at Minnesota and the Twin Cities as, on some level, ground zero for police killing of young black men, and that's where you see fear manifest, in very tragic ways. So it's bad.
Other questions? Anybody? All right, I'll ask a question. Your students, yes, there is a great diversity of viewpoints among them. However, I think they are the leading edge of the move to protect children, the end of free-range parenting. And are there assumptions that they bring to the classroom because of this, to maybe our old-fashioned ways of thinking, excessively sheltered, excessively protected youth?
I don't know. I really don't. I don't know the answer to that. We talk about these things in the abstract, and we bring up the issue of the sort of helicopter parenting and all, and we talk about it. But it's, and sometimes they talk about their own experiences. But, I haven't done, and, again, anecdotal evidence is just who is willing to kind of talk about their own experiences. And there is I think a lot of good work being done on this topic. Maybe, sociologists and even anthropologists and ethnographers on the impact of these practices. But again, they don't make anybody any safer. We know that. We know that.
Any other questions? Anybody else's hands up? If not, we're going to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.